Hello, folks. Looks like we got actually got a nice crowd joining us today. Again, it's Matthew Spady here, and I'd like to welcome you to this James Walk. And with me is Joe Amodio.
Hello, everyone. I'm a journalist, and Matthew is a historian and author, and we are pleased that you're here to join us on this virtual walk. No actual cardio here through Washington Heights. We're going to pass through areas from the Hudson River on inland, and we'll pass the site of a sugar refinery and a wharf that was built by Dennis Harris, an abolitionist who was central to the development of Washington Heights. And then we're going to work our way inland to various sites, places of various homes of other abolitionists who were in this little known community that existed back in the 1840s and 50s. And we're glad to have you here, and we will end up at 857 Riverside Drive, which has been the site of some recent publicity. It is the only building among these various sites that we're going to cover. It's the only building still standing, and it is one that is in danger of demolition today.
Thanks, Joe. So before we get started, let me tell you just a little bit about this James Walk for any of you who may not be familiar with them. While I'm doing that, please feel free to write in the chat who you are, where you are at the moment. If you've taken a James Walk before, introduce yourself to the other folks who are currently on the walk with us. James Walks happen in May of every year. It is a festival of walks in which people are encouraged to get out and explore their neighborhoods and each other, work with each other, that is. In Manhattan, James Walks are sponsored by the Municipal Art Society, which is a 125-year-old organization that works to improve New York City's built environment, and it leads the way to a more livable city from sidewalk to skyline. So as I was saying, we will ask you to remain muted during the walk. I apologize if my mouse keeps floating across the screen. I'm admitting other people and every now and then muting someone if I'm hearing some background noise. Anyway, let's get started. For those of you who may not be familiar with the area, there's a map over there on the left, has the Empire State Building. Down there at the bottom, you have the Upper East Side. Then you get up to Upper Manhattan, and here we are. The red arrow shows you at 155th Street. On the map on the other side, on the right-hand side, we're going to go through several places. We're going to start, as Joe said, at a refinery. And this map, by the way, is around 1860. This isn't the present-day map, but you can see the cross streets there to give you a sense of where we are. So there is a refinery there on the water. We'll start there. That's about 160th Street and the river. From there, we will go up to a house which belonged to Ambrose Kingsland. So we started at the sugar refinery, then we're going to a wharf, then we're going up to about 161st Street where Ambrose Kingsland's mansion was. Then we're going to go over to 158th Street to where Dennis Harris had his home. Then we're going to go over to 155th and Amsterdam, which was then known as 10th Avenue, where there is a Presbyterian church that we'll investigate. And finally, as Joe said, we're going to end up at 857 Riverside Drive, which is a significant house in the northern Manhattan's abolitionist community. So let's move on to the next slide here. We're not going to be able to, of course, walk exactly through the neighborhood, but we wanted you to see some of the buildings that give it its particular character. The street give it a sense of place here in our neighborhood.
at the center of our tale is a man named Dennis Harris, who was a sugar refiner during the week, and on the weekends he was an abolitionist preacher. And unfortunately, we don't know what he looked like, but we know his associates, many notable New Yorkers of the period, people like Lewis Tappan, who, if we can jump to the next screen, he's there, right there on the left, a wealthy merchant and leading abolitionist who helped free the enslaved people on the ship, the Amistad. You may remember that from the film Amistad. Harris also supported Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell. He was friends with her family for years, and he helped fund her infirmary in Manhattan. She's the first female physician in the US. And he was known to invite people of color onto his pulpit to speak, which was very unusual for the time. People like Henry Bibb here, who was born a slave and went on to become a renowned author. Alas, we've yet to find a photograph of Dennis Harris himself, but we have found proof that he was a station master on the Underground Railroad. Precise details about the Underground Railroad are sketchy. It's estimated that about 100 people a year came through New York City on their way north to Canada. There were, over the 30 years that preceded the Civil War, it's estimated that there were probably tens of thousands of people who escaped slavery through various routes up through the Middle Atlantic states and more into the Midwest, any way they could get into Canada. Now, of these folks, one such man who came through New York was George Kirk. He stowed away on a brig out of Savannah, Georgia, and docked in downtown New York in October 1846. Now, slavery had been abolished in New York, but the state was still decidedly pro-slavery, as it was a big, profitable industry. So when George Kirk gets here, he is chased through the streets by a violent mob right through City Hall Park, and he manages to make it to the offices of the American Anti-Slavery Society, which hide him under the floorboards. But now what? The story makes all the papers about the chase and the confusion. Thugs and police have the offices surrounded. So the folks in the anti-slavery office decide to call on Dennis Harris and hatch a plan. Harris at the time had a sugar refinery down on Duane Street, and he was known to hide people escaping slavery there for periods of time. So they pack up George Kirk in a wooden crate, and Harris sends a wagon and picks up the crate and all these other boxes like it's, just a standard delivery to the refinery, business as usual. But the wagon never makes it. We found a political cartoon at the time which shows what happens next. The police stopped the wagon, broke open the crate, and pulled out Kirk, spewing racial epithets. The description of it was pretty awful, as you can imagine. It was basically a Black Lives Matter moment in every way, save for the cell phones. Now, good news for George Kirk, he was arrested, but a judge threw the case out, and the Underground Railroad was able to hustle him out of the city immediately after. But bad news for Harris, his refinery burned down 2 years later. But ever the entrepreneur, he decided to try his luck uptown, where he started buying up land, building houses, and establishing a new refinery.
Thanks, Joe. So let's begin our walk down here at the Hudson River. This is about 160th Street in what is now Riverside Park. And this is the location where Dennis Harris had his uptown sugar refinery. In the distance, you can see the George Washington Bridge. There on the right, you can see the Henry Hudson Parkway. If we were to turn 90 degrees and look down towards the lower Manhattan, we'd see at the foot of 158th Street, and that's where Dennis Harris had his wharf. This is what it looked like, or this is an artist's interpretation of what it looked like back in the 1850s. There you see Dennis Harris's sugar refinery, the New Congress Steam Sugar Refinery. You see there's a wharf in front of there where they are loading or unloading barrels, probably, of the sugar that has been refined from the sugar cane. Over on the right-hand side, you can see another wharf. That's the wharf that serviced the Jenny Lind. Dennis Harris and his brother William began steamboat service from Lower Manhattan all the way to Poughkeepsie, with stops along the way. And one of those stops was here at 158th Street. It was named after Jenny Lind, the opera singer who was the Swedish Nightingale. She came to the United States at the behest of P.T. Barnum and toured with his circus. And she was quite popular and well known here in the early 1850s when the Harris brothers started their steamboat service. Just a moment, let me say a word about just sugar refining in general, and the sort of irony of someone who was an abolitionist refining sugar, which relied heavily on the harvesting of sugar cane, which was done mainly by enslaved labor. Dennis Harris learned the refining business from Samuel Blackwell. Just a moment ago, Joe told you about Elizabeth Blackwell, who was an acquaintance of Harris's. Her father was Samuel Blackwell. He was also an ardent abolitionist. He and Dennis Harris came to the United States from England on the same boat. And on the boat, they made friends. When they got here, Blackwell hired Dennis Harris to build a refinery for him, and then taught him the sugar business. That's how a sugar refining business. That's how Harris got into it. Samuel Blackwell, in fact, tried to figure out a way to. I'll ask everyone who has just joined to please mute themselves. And Joe, I think I inadvertently just muted you. Just 1 second, folks. Sorry for the interruption. Okay. So as I was saying, they met on the boat on the way. Samuel Blackwell asked Harris to build a refinery for him because Harris was a bricklayer by profession. He was also a Methodist minister, quite well-rounded man. And he learned the refinery business from Blackwell. While we're on this slide, though, Joe, perhaps you could say a little bit about the importance of the river for the Underground Railroad.
Yes. Just one thing about the sugar refining business being an odd business for someone who was also an abolitionist. Both Blackwell, who taught Dennis Harris the sugar trade, and Dennis Harris himself and their families, they basically spent their lifetimes trying to figure out how to create sugar from other forms rather than sugarcane that was the primary crop down in the South and in the tropics, which used slave labor. They were trying their darndest to come up with ways to create sugar out of sugar beets, which could be grown here in the North, which would be just grown by farmers themselves without slave labor. Their efforts never really took off, unfortunately, but they were constantly looking for ways to take the sugar refining industry out of the hands of slave owners down south and in the tropics. So that was one way in which they were trying to balance those two gigs, as it were. In terms of the ferry, what's interesting here is that water transport was a major means of moving people around in the Underground Railroad. Land travel was tough, and public transportation was segregated. People of color were often kicked off of trains or horse-drawn buses. And particularly interesting about this ferry is Harris's timing. He establishes this ferry service right around the period when Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which required that escaped slaves be returned to their owners, even in free states. So this made New York riskier than ever for people of color. Waves of bounty hunters flooded downtown Manhattan. And so Harris's Uptown Refinery and a steamboat that could help get you there were needed now more than ever. Matthew?
Thanks, Joe. So let's proceed on our walk. We're going to walk up these stairs, which are there in Riverside Park. And when we get to the top, we'll be at the foot of 158th Street. This is where 158th is a entrance and exit from the Henry Hudson Parkway. Looking through that archway, which is Riverside Drive West, looking through that, we can look up 158th Street that leads up to Broadway and then Amsterdam beyond that. This was a major thoroughfare, 158th Street, beginning in the 1850s. Harris probably had something to do with that, since that's where his refinery was, there at the foot, or his dock was at the foot, and his refinery was at 160th. Just south of here in the 1850s was the home of John James Audubon. He had moved his family there in the 1840s to a farm called Minnie's Land, and he lived there for the last 10 years of his life. Here's a map of Minnie's Land. You can see there at the top, 157th and 158th Street I was just talking about. Minnie's Land stretched from about Amsterdam Avenue, 10th Avenue back in that time, over to the river from 158th 155th to 158th, although as you can see, it was an irregular shape. So you had three interlocking rectangles there. The Audubons lived there, as I say. It was a working farm. They moved there in the 1840s. During that time, they were using the farm as sustenance farming. One of the interesting things to think about or to notice is that where present-day Broadway is, they had an orchard of about 200 trees. Audubon died in 1851, just about the time that Dennis Harris had moved north and was accumulating property in the neighborhood. The Audubon family always had financial problems. The Birds of America was a huge artistic success, but not a financial success for the family. And their problems worsened during the 1840s, financial problems. Shortly after Audubon died, his wife Lucy sold the eastern portion of the farm to Dennis Harris, that area over there where you see fields for crops between 155th and 156th. Harris was already accumulating land and had a lot of that north of that point. Within a few years, Lucy Audubon and her sons divided their remaining property into large building lots and built villas on them, Italianate villas. Within a few years, the farm had evolved into a suburb called Audubon Park. You had these villas set among curving drives, manicured lawns, and ornate gardens. So let's now turn to our left, to the north, and we're going to walk up these stairs to get up to Riverside Drive. There are 48 of them, which probably makes you glad that this is a virtual walk. And then we're at the top of the stairs.
At the top here, we're at the corner where Riverside Drive meets Riverside Drive West at about 161st Street. We can cross, mind the construction on the right. They're repairing the viaduct underneath us, and it's kind of a mess. Ahead of us are the River Arts Apartments, which were built in 1941, and they sit pretty much due east, just a few steps due east of where the sugar refinery would have been. If we go around the corner here and head down Riverside, we can stop for a moment, admire the lovely lilac in the River Arts Gardens, because we have more stairs ahead of us here at 160th Street. These are the last ones, we promise. At the top of the stairs, we'll turn left, northward, and walk a few steps up. This is, by the way, the service road of Riverside Drive, what locals here call the Upper Drive. And if we just walk up to the corner of 161st Street, you'll see the Loyal apartment house built in 1914. The architect was Harold L. Young, who built several of the tall apartment houses nearby. And this building is named for Loyal Smith, who owned the property where it sits today. Architectural historian Michael Henry Adams, who wrote the book Harlem Lost and Found. Just as an aside, it's a beautiful coffee table book. Highly recommend that if you're not familiar with it. Harlem Lost and Found tells the story of many buildings up here in the upper Manhattan area. And he notes that the builders of this particular apartment building seem to have been inspired by the Doge Palace in Venice. If you note the rather Doge-like ornamentation around the entrance, it has a bit of that Venetian Doge-like feel. Now, in Dennis Harris's day, the site looked very different. This is the home here that stood on the spot in 1849 when Dennis Harris and his family moved in. It had been built less than a decade earlier by Ambrose Kingsland, a wealthy New York merchant who became mayor of New York City shortly thereafter in 1851. Don't imagine that we don't imagine Harris voted for him, because as Mayor Kingsland ordered the African-American community, Seneca Village, evacuated and destroyed in preparation for the construction of Central Park. Dennis Harris bought this house and a large parcel of land from Kingsland, and his family lived here while he was building his refinery and some other houses down on 158th Street, which we'll catch a glimpse of in a few minutes. This house, alas, burned down in 1916 while they were at work trying to extend 161st Street westward.
And so now let's walk down the upper Riverside Drive. We're going to go back to 158th Street. On the way, we're going to have a glimpse of the oldest house in the neighborhood. If you look there on the right, sorry, I'm quite dyslexic when it comes to left and right. On the right, we'll see the oldest house in the neighborhood. It's that little square one there, sort of tucked away in between the larger buildings. We're going to circle back to that at the end of our walk. So I'll just point it out to you as we're walking along back down Upper Riverside Drive to 158th. So here at 158th, that's the street that's crossing in front of us across our path. We have the Grinnell apartment building there on the right. Beyond that, in the distance, you can see the Church of the Intercession. You can see right in front of us the 1 block long Edward M. Morgan Place, which is named for New York City's first postmaster general to rise to that rank from being a postal delivery man. The Grinnell, which, as I say, is there on our right, is named for the family that owned a large part of Audubon Park after the Audubons did. After the Audubons started selling off their property, George Blake Grinnell, the father of his family, began to accumulate it. And by the time he died in 1891, he owned about 2/3 of the park, which he left to his children, who then oversaw the change of suburban Audubon Park into the cityscape we see today. The Grinnell sits on land that was once their cow pasture. It's a triangular building with a large courtyard. Early marketing advertised that every room was an outside room, meaning that you had a window either on that large courtyard or on the street. As I say, it's triangular, so it has streets on all 3 sides. While we're looking at this photograph, it's interesting to remember that all of this land that we can see here was owned in the colonial and early American eras by the Watkins family. They farmed it and they increased their wealth on enslaved labor. John Watkins died in 1786, right after the American Revolution. His wife Lydia lived there with her children and still farmed into the 1800s. In 1799, New York State passed the Gradual Emancipation Act, which gradually emancipated the enslaved people. If a child was born at that time, they had to serve as an indentured servant. However, they were not enslaved. When Lydia Watkins died in 1811, she freed her remaining enslaved people, and they're named actually in her will, Hannon and Jane, and 3 of their 4 children. Their 4th child, Peter, remained, I guess he was very young, he remained in the service of Lydia's son, Samuel Watkins, until he was at the age of 26. Also interesting to note, this land, or part of it, was owned by John James Audubon. His father was in the slave trade. John James Audubon himself was born on the island of Saint Dominique, which is now Haiti. His mother, who was a French chambermaid, died shortly after his birth, within weeks of his birth. And his father's mistress, who was a mixed race woman, raised Audubon the first few years of his life. So the first mother that he knew was a mixed race woman. He also had three half sisters who were of mixed race. When Audubon was only about 4 years old, his father took him to France, where his father's legal wife raised Audubon as her own son, and one of those three mixed-race half-sisters, who apparently was light enough that she could pass as white in French society. Despite all of this, Audubon was a slaveholder himself in the late 18 teens, 1815, 1819, in that area. He had slaves, owned slaves, when he and his wife, Lucy, lived in Kentucky. So we had these various layers of racial history involved with or associated with the land that we're walking on today, not only Dennis Harris, the abolitionist, but these other layers. And one more, if you look in the distance there, you see the Mitchell-Lama building, which is River Terrace Apartments, that was built in the 1960s. That the Mitchell-Lama buildings, apartment buildings, are co-ops and rentals. They were built for affordable housing, but also to racially and financially integrate buildings and neighborhoods. There are many well-known people who have lived there. I suppose the most well-known is the late David Dinkins, who was New York City's first and to date only African-American mayor. So again, just to point out the many layers of history that we're walking through today. Now, at this intersection, if we look towards the west, we can look down West 158th Street. We're not going to walk all the way down, but if we did, we would see this row of 12 houses, row houses that were designed by John P. Leo and built between 1896 and 1898.
This photograph shows what the houses looked like back then. The man standing in the doorway may or may not be Mr. Leo himself. Kind of like to think it might be. At the far end, you can see an old house with a porch, which is one of the homes that Dennis Harris built on this block in the early 1850s. That was home to Shepard Knapp, another active abolitionist in the neighborhood. He presided over an anti-slavery rally downtown in 1854, which drew thousands, apparently. And if you see a little terrier puppy wandering around, please return it to Mr. Knapp. Matthew managed to find this old newspaper ad in which Knapp was announcing that he had lost his puppy. This was in 1856, and the reward was $10, which was quite a tidy sum back in those days. Matthew?
So let's go up 158th Street. We're going to work our way towards Broadway. On the way on the left is a tall wedding cake building. That's the Sutherland apartment house, completed in 1910, designed by the noted apartment house architect Emery Roth. If you've read The Great Gatsby, you may remember a scene in which Myrtle Wilson, who was the mistress, came up through the park, through Central Park, and up the west side of Manhattan to 158th Street, where the cab stopped. And the way Fitzgerald describes it is stopped in one slice in a long white cake of apartment houses. Mrs. Wilson got out of the cab and she threw a regal glance around the neighborhood before she gathered up her dog and her purchases and went in. Many people in the neighborhood like to think that Fitzgerald was referring to the Sutherland apartment house when he was writing that. Of course, people across the street at the Grinnell like to think that it was their building that he was referring to. Let's pause a moment, though, as we go up Broadway here at 158th Street. We're going to turn south on on Broadway at 158th. But if we continued over towards Amsterdam, we would come to a place where Dennis Harris did some of his development. It's interesting to sort of look at this map and see how over in Audubon Park, the development was very park-like. You had houses on very large building lots. They're facing in different directions. You have these curvilinear drives. There were ornate gardens, forest trees. Many of the houses sat on promontories so that they overlooked the house to the west, and they all had a very nice view of the Hudson River and the Palisades beyond. However, the property that Dennis Harris owned on the other side of what would eventually become Broadway had already begun to adhere to the grid. The grid stopped at 155th Street when the commissioners were appointed back in the early 1800s to lay out Manhattan Street, and they chose a grid plan. They stopped at 155th. The reason, they gave two reasons. One was they didn't think Manhattan would grow beyond that point for several hundred years. The other was that they didn't want to encourage land speculation because when you lay out lots in equal sizes and compare apples to apples, that seems to spur speculation because people know where the streets are going to be, and speculators tend to buy up more property. That's the principle there. Of course, neither of those things were correct. Manhattan grew beyond 155th well before 100 years were up, and speculation in land has always been a sort of popular gamble from the earliest days of Manhattan, when the Dutch first arrived, right up through today. Notice also there on that street on West 155th Street, and I think I have an arrow, yes, Dennis Harris had begun building these houses, probably for some of the workmen who were at his refinery. Notice that they're all similar size, they're all oriented to the street, they're all on the same size lot. So he's really beginning to think in terms of that grid. He also built a tenement house, which sat here on the corner of 157th Street and future Broadway. This was definitely for the workmen in the refinery. He hired John Woodhouse Audubon, who was John James Audubon's son, to build that for him. The locals called it the Dutch house. The reason was that many of the workers who lived there were German, Deutsch, and just a sort of mispronunciation of that, they called it the Dutch house. We do have also a image of what that looked like. This is from the Blackwell maps that were drawn in the early 1860s. There was another commission which was to lay out streets in northern Manhattan. They didn't actually lay them out. They spent 4 years getting organized, and the main thing that they left was these wonderful maps, which are now in the borough president's office. This is a sketch for the map. You can see the tenement house there on the left. Unlike tenements that you would see or that we are more accustomed to in the Lower East Side, this one had light and air on all sides. It was, though, a multifamily residence. There was a coal shed there on the north side and a coal and wood shed on the southern side. The privy over on the east, with its proximity to the well there in the center, reminds us why things like cholera epidemics were rampant in the 19th century. So again, this is some of the development that Dennis Harris was doing, in addition to his refinery, in addition to the ferry service that he had there at the foot of 158th Street. So now let's walk south on Broadway. We're going to go down to 157th Street. That's the photo there on the left. We're going to cross to the east side of Broadway. When we get there, we're going to turn around and look back. You can see the Sutherland that I was just describing, peeping there over those shorter buildings. Those short buildings, by the way, are called taxpayers. A taxpayer was a building that an owner created or built and kept there long enough to pay the taxes on the property while they waited for the values to rise or sold it or put something more valuable on it. They were temporary buildings. These were built in 1905, which begs the definition of what temporary might be. The person who built them was Adolph Lewison. Lewis was a philanthropist and a financier. He was the benefactor of Lewison Stadium, which stood for years at City College. Interestingly enough, I mentioned the Great Gatsby earlier. Lewison was known as the Jewish Gadsby. So now this is the same scene back in 1905. Over on the left is Audubon Park. That area will soon be covered with apartment buildings. They're in the distance, or actually sort of dominating the photograph. You can see the Church of the Intercession. This was its second location. Its third and present location is in Trinity Cemetery at the corner of 155th and Broadway. You can see the subway kiosks, the uptown and downtown. The subway had opened just about 6 months before this photograph was taken. Right there in front of the church, you see that very tall house with a mansard roof to it. That is the home of John Daly. John Daly was the son-in-law of Dennis Harris, married to one of Dennis Harris's several daughters. He built that house in the early 1850s. This is a later manifestation of it. It has that mansard roof that was probably added later, probably in the late 1860s, has piazzas on all sides. But that is, as I say, the house of John Daly, who was the son-in-law of Dennis Harris. And Joe's going to tell you a couple of important other things about this photograph.
One key thing about this photo, we see Broadway heading north on the right side of the photo, but jutting off at a diagonal on the left was the start of a street that was called Boulevard Lafayette, named for the great French general who helped Washington fight the British in the Revolutionary War. This road was just being built at this time in the hopes of being one of the world's grand thoroughfares. And when it was completed, it was apparently quite beautiful, curving and winding its way north through the woods along the Hudson with magnificent views of the Palisades, eventually reaching Dyckman Street. Today, it's part of Riverside Drive, and its grandeur is sort of usurped by the on-ramps to the George Washington Bridge. Nonetheless, for a time, back in this time, it was really something.
So let's continue east on 157th Street. We're working our way over to Amsterdam Avenue. Just before we get to Amsterdam, we can stop for a moment and admire that repurposed stable there with the row houses beside it. All of those are from the late 19th century. And as we get to the corner and look across the street, we can see what appear to be French flats. Those buildings were a popular format in the 1870s and 1880s as multiple family dwellings. They were an intermediate step in the move between row houses, single family homes, and tenements to the apartment buildings that began arising in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The French flat buildings tended to be between 4 and 6 stories tall. They usually were the double width of a row house, and so they really fit into the cityscape rather unobtrusively. They looked not unlike the row houses that surrounded them. And as I say, they were an important, very important typology in the development of the 20th century row house.
Now we're walking south on Amsterdam Avenue, and in the middle of this block, sort of right where this massive apartment complex is the site back in the day of the Washington Heights Congregational Church, an abolitionist church that was founded and funded by a group of progressive neighbors in this community. Dennis Harris and his son-in-law, John Daly, whose house was right across the street from the Church of the Intercession there. Harris's friend, Judge John Newhouse, and his son-in-law, John Tinnell, were part of this group of founders. The church started as a small wooden chapel halfway down the block of Amsterdam. And this is where Harris preached his devotion to temperance and his hatred of slavery. And it drew important speakers of the day, notably James W.C. Pennington. James Pennington, seen here, was huge at the time. He'd escaped slavery, wound up attending classes at Yale and became a renowned orator and abolitionist, probably second only to Frederick Douglass. He spoke at the church in 1854 with his brother, and it was, by all accounts, an incredibly emotional talk. His brother had just escaped slavery that year with his sons, and they unfortunately they had escaped, and then they were captured by slave hunters, and Pennington himself had to go down and manage to buy back his brother, but he was too late to get to his nephews, who were quickly sold off into slavery into the Deep South, which was often the case when slave catchers would catch someone who was escaping. Pennington and his brother spoke about that experience and how they would both give anything to be able to purchase the freedom of their mother, but she'd been sold and sold and sold so often that they had lost track of her, and neither one of them at this point knew where she was. The story apparently brought both Pennington and his brother and the congregation to tears, and they wound up taking up a collection for the cause. Okay, so let's head down one block to Amsterdam and 155th Street. Here, the church was growing in size, and so members of the community pitched in to fund the building of a new church on this corner. Not just Harris and Newhouse and their sons-in-law, but also Shepherd Knapp, the abolitionist and puppy lover, the Grinnells, who had eventually that big building named after them, all of these folks and some others who lived in Audubon Park, and a host of other prominent families in the area all supported this church. We can see from the floor plans that the name changed from Congregationalist to the Washington Heights Presbyterian Church, and the fact that it was allowing people of color to not only be present, but actually to speak on the pulpit, that was sadly very unusual for the time period. Back then, most churches tried to avoid the issue of slavery. Their attitude was kind of one of, oh, let's not bring politics into the church, shall we? And unfortunately, then many churches just did not address the issue. As we see in the next slide, the church that this community built was rather impressive. Alas, all of these buildings are now gone. The refinery, the wharf, Harris's grand home, the tenement house, and finally this church, which burned to the ground in 1908. There's only one building still standing from this time period, which is a symbol to this day of the brave and unusual community that helped build Washington Heights.
And that house is at 857 Riverside Drive, and we could go there in just a moment. But I'm going to back up one slide because there might be a little confusion, and I can tell you it's taken me several years to sort out Dennis Harris's sort of religious affiliation. As I mentioned earlier, he was an ordained Methodist minister. However, in the 1840s, he separated from that church, from the Methodist Church, over the issue of slavery. The Methodist Church split, and the group that split away was called the Wesleyan Methodists, or the Wesleyans. And Dennis Harris helped found the New York branch of that church. Then, as Joe was telling you, he helped found a congregational church with his son-in-law and with other members of the community, which evolved into the Presbyterian Church. But if you notice here on the map, right next door is a Methodist church, which was meeting in a building on Dennis Harris's property. So he had never really fully forsaken his Methodist roots. I think it's really interesting how he was sort of an ecumenical person when it came to which denomination, but the one overriding or all-encompassing feature of it was that his religion and his abolitionist activities were one and the same. So now, as Joe said, sorry, Joe.
Oh no, I was just going to say, it seems that the change from Congregationalist church to Washington Heights Presbyterian Church was one basically of funding. Apparently they started out as Congregationalists, but the Congregational church, the overarching institution at the time, just didn't have a whole lot of money to funnel their way, and the parishioners eventually just decided that they might get more support as an institution from the Presbyterians, and well, they did. One last interesting note for anyone who lives in the neighborhood: while this particular church burned down, the congregation itself continued. They had actually moved to another church just down the road on 155th Street, to in between Amsterdam and Broadway, and it's there today. It's the North Presbyterian Church, which is basically right across the street from the Trinity Cemetery. So the church itself continues on, but the building.
Exactly, and there's a image there that you can see of the building for North Presbyterian. So let's move on. As Joe said, we're going to go back. We'll take the fast route here, back over to 857 Riverside Drive, where we're going to end our walk. Here's 857 Riverside Drive. As I mentioned when we passed it earlier, it dates to 1851, the same time that the Audubons were developing Audubon Park. John King was a man who bought this property from Dennis Harris. Shortly after Dennis Harris bought the Kingsland Mansion and all the property, he advertised that there were building lots for sale, and a man named John King bought this one and had the house built. It's quite possible, given the timing, that John Woodhouse Audubon either designed it or built it for him, or both, designed and built it for him, as that's what he was doing in Audubon Park for his family there. And also, as I mentioned earlier, he built that tenement house for Dennis Harris. He also, by the way, built or helped build the first building for the Church of the Intercession. So he was quite handy with that. And as I say, it's quite possible that he participated in building this church, this house. John King only held the house for a year, and then he sold it back to Dennis Harris. Dennis Harris left it vacant almost 3 years, and then sold it to a man named John Newhouse, who Joe has mentioned already in our story.
And this is what the house looked like in 1938, when the famed photographer Louise Abbott photographed the house for an exhibition that she was putting together on called Changing New York. It was a series of photographs of old 19th century homes that she felt certain were not long for this world, that were going to be demolished and replaced by newer buildings. And in fact, every single one of the buildings that were shown in that exhibit are gone now, except for this one. You can see back then, you can look through the porch and kind of get a glimpse of the river. This had a magnificent view of the river. Unfortunately, that view is gone now. The River Arts Apartments were built shortly after this photograph was taken. When the house was first built, the porch wrapped all the way around, but when more modern development came along at the beginning of the 20th century, they had to chop off the right side of the porch in order to make way for the townhouse immediately next door. But the way this house looks, if you can imagine the porch going all the way around, is essentially what it looked like back in the 1850s when it was on a 3-acre parcel of land. Harris sold it to Newhouse back then. Newhouse was a judge and was working with Harris running the wharf and the refinery. And as we can see in the 1855 census, he moved into the house with his whole family, and his wife, his second wife, who was 24 to his 44, which made her just a couple of years older than his children. They moved into the house with his daughter, Catherine, and her husband, John Tennell, who would eventually help with the founding of the church, and their baby son. Also, some of the other Newhouse children were there, 3 other Newhouse children, a 12-year-old boarder who was a relative of John Tennell, plus 2 Irish servants, and John Newhouse's 65-year-old mother. Now, you might be wondering how they managed to fit so many people in this modest 2-story house. The secret, as you can see, is in the back. The house is built on a slope, and it's actually 4 stories. It was, again, as you can see, eventually crunched in by its taller neighbors. Now, we know that Dennis Harris built the house in 1851, and it sat empty for 3 years. So the $64,000 question is, did he use it for the Underground Railroad? And the short answer is, we don't know. But as you can see from this aerial shot, it would have been a perfect location way uptown and right by the river. You can see it there sort of right in the middle of the picture. We can get a little bit closer. Given its size, its rural location, and its proximity to the refinery and the steamboat wharf, it would have been judged ideal in the fight against slavery, a fact that would not have gone unnoticed by an abolitionist of Harris's experience and dedication. And we know that Harris was involved with the Underground Railroad downtown in the 1840s. So when he moved uptown in the 1850s, it doesn't make any logical sense that he would have a change of heart just because he had a change of address. And as we mentioned at the beginning about the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, the things really started heating up on this issue in the 1850s. So he would have been all the more driven, you would think, to do whatever he could to support the Underground Railroad in the increasingly dangerous times. Now, the fact that so much anti-slavery sentiment was shared by his neighbors up here is rather historic. If you look in history books about abolitionists in New York, all the activity is pretty much Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn. The Landmarks Commission only has a handful of abolitionist sites that are landmarked, and the furthest north that they go is 29th Street. So the fact that this group up here exists in an area of the city that would become known for its racial and cultural diversity, and in fact would give birth to the first African-American mayor in the city. We think that makes the discovery of this group pretty special.
It does indeed, Joe. We've come to the end of our walk. I'd like to point out that the group called the Upper Riverside Residents Alliance is working to expand the Audubon Park Historic District. You can see the map there on the left. The Audubon Park Historic District in the gold color, and the pink area is the expansion area, which includes this house, 857 Riverside Drive. We're working to have this landmarked so that we can preserve this house for future generations. I'll also mention, in case you're interested in learning more about the Audubon Park neighborhood, that Fordham University Press published my History of the Neighborhood Manhattan Forgot, in last September. It's available from Fordham University Press, or you can order it directly from your local bookseller, or of course, online at one of the online booksellers as well. Now, I'd like to invite all of you, if you like, to activate your cameras again and see if there are any questions. I'm going to look here through the chat window to see if there are any here. I don't see any at the moment. Well, actually, are there any good recommended books on abolitionists in New York City? Joe, you've done a lot of research in this area. I think a lot of it was sort of primary sources like newspapers and censuses, but any books that you ran across?
Yeah, there are several books by an historian named Tom Calarco. That's Calarco. He has written, he wrote a book specifically about abolitionists in New York State. But he's written other books about the abolition movement in different parts of the country. So depending on where you are, you can look his name up and see if there is a book about your specific area. There's also, it's a historical fiction, but a Pulitzer Prize winner, Colson Whitehead's book, The Underground Railroad, gives an incredibly well-documented and dramatic telling of what it was like to live in that period and be involved in this movement.
There was a question about whether Tappan, and Joe, I hope you know the answer. If not, we can maybe follow up later, is related to Tappan of Tappan Zee Bridge. Any idea?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. My guess is yes, because it was a big name then. He and his brother Arthur were wealthy merchants, and don't know. We'll get back to you.
Yeah, exactly. There's a question here about the house, or actually a comment that the house looks quite different. It does indeed. We have had when I say we, the Upper Riverside Residents Alliance has had an engineer look at the house, actually an engineer and an architectural historian, or sorry, not a renovation historian. What's the proper term, Joe? I'm sorry, it's just gone out of my head.
Well, an engineer.
Yeah, an engineer. But we also had an architect look at it who estimated what we need to do to restore it. And there's a lot of the fabric of the house remaining. Over the windows and doors, for example, you have the original...
the original brackets are still there.
The brackets are there. And probably underneath, you can see on the side that the wood framing is still there. That's probably on the front. We have part of the piazza, which is still there, and on the back. So it could be restored. There's also, you remember in the earlier picture, there was a lantern on the top, or what looks like a cupola. The base for that is still there. So it could be restored if we can manage to keep it around long enough to do that.
It brings up an interesting question, actually, which is troubling to preservationists around the country, which is the issue of buildings that do or do not get landmarked or designated as landmarks in communities of color. The disparity in New York City is astounding. If you look at the map of designations, the communities of color there's a huge disparity between whiter, wealthier neighborhoods and the number of buildings that are designated as landmarks versus those in poorer, less white neighborhoods. And this is not just a problem in New York City, but across the country. And part of the problem is that one of the key elements in order to get a building landmarked is its visual appearance and how much it looks like it did back in the day, how much it is able to convey a sense of that older time period. That is not actually a component that is written into the law that established the Landmarks Commission in New York City itself, but it is often one of the criteria that is used to choose a house or an area for designation, and that's great. But the problem is that in poorer areas, in areas that where communities of color have lived for decades, they have been homeowners with less cash on their hands traditionally, and often they are homeowners with less cash on their hands because of systemic racism, because they were working in jobs where they didn't get paid as much as their white counterparts, because they were buying homes with and having to struggle to get mortgages because of racist programs like redlining. So they just traditionally, these communities did not have as much, they didn't have the liquidity that would be required to keep up homes like this one. And as anyone who has owned a home in general, and certainly an older home, you know what that they are just a cash pit. There's always something going wrong with the roof, with the siding, with whatever. And unfortunately, that means that a lot of the buildings and sites that have compelling stories to tell in less affluent neighborhoods are not landmarked, because they don't quite look as good as they did back in the day, and they don't look as good as some other buildings in more affluent neighborhoods. And that's a problem that landmarks commissioners across the country are going to have to start looking at. They're going to have to reevaluate, I think, their decision making when it comes to homes like this one in less affluent neighborhoods.
Thank you, Joy. I agree with everything that you just said. We have a couple other questions here. One, someone who had a connection that wasn't working properly didn't catch the references to Seneca Village and to cholera. The Seneca Village had to do with Mayor Ambrose Kingsland. He owned that large house that Dennis Harris bought. Kingsland was mayor after he owned that house. He was mayor in the early 1850s. And while he was mayor, he was the person who signed the paperwork to get moving with displacing the people in Seneca Village, clearing Seneca Village away to begin construction of Central Park. The reference to cholera was on that tenement house that Dennis Harris built on 157th Street. You had the tenement itself, and then you had these sheds for wood, and then on the eastern side of the property was the privy, and then in the center of the property was the well, which was in really dangerous proximity to the privy to have clean water. And I was remarking that sort of is one of those images that makes us realize why diseases like cholera, epidemics like cholera, were so prevalent in the earlier years before water sanitation became more important.
And one other thing, Matthew, about Seneca Village, just the basics. Seneca Village was a small little community that existed primarily consisting of African Americans. It existed around West 79th Street, West 80th Street, and Central Park West, what is now Central Park West. And in one of the first examples of eminent domain, New York City and I guess New York State came in and took over a huge swath of land in the middle of Manhattan in order to make Central Park. And part of that land included this little African American community, which of course at the time they just kind of figured, well, no big deal, we can just destroy that and push it out of the way. And it made way for a beautiful parkland, but of course the choice to get rid of that community in the way that they did is hopefully we would choose to do it a little differently today.
Joe, we have one question here. Could you put the book and film recommendation in the chat? Would you type those in the chat?
Oh,
good.
Sure.
And then there's a question here. Let's see. Was the Hudson served to move escaped slaves north? And if so, could Harris's dock have been used for this? And yes, that's one of the points that we think really is important. Harris used his refinery in Lower Manhattan as a stop on the Underground Railroad. When he moved north and built a new refinery, we have no reason to think he would not have done the same here. His activities show that he was still very active in the abolitionist movement, using his dock, using the ferry, or one of the boats coming to his refinery could have been a way that he could have secreted someone farther north on the way to Canada. And so, yes, those are all parts of the story and the evidence that suggests strongly that this abolitionist group in northern Manhattan was in fact not just active preaching against abolition, but as part of the Underground Railroad. Let's see, we also have a comment that you can go to saveriverside.org if you want to see more photos of the house and read more about the effort to landmark it and the neighborhood. I think that pretty much takes care. Let me just scroll through to make sure, because in previous walks they've ended and I've realized we didn't get all the questions. I think that we have, oh wait, there's one down at the bottom. Yes, oh, actually, that was where Joe put in the books about the abolitionist movement. And there's also the Underground Railroad, which is a book which has been made into a film, and I understand that film is now available on Amazon Prime. So if you want to watch that, that's now available. So again, we'd like to thank all of you for joining the walk, for sticking with us through to the end, for your great questions. And I will remind you that Jane's Walk goes on through the rest of this week. Do check back and look at the listings and join other walks. And there are also those on-demand ones that you can join. And there are some that you can download and do the walk yourself. So again, thank you very much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. We've enjoyed sharing our history of Northern Manhattan. And now if I can figure out the ins and outs of, here we go. Yes, I will now end the meeting for all of us. Again, thanks very much.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.